Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and also for the chance to kind of hold the floor for half an hour and talk to you. I hope you'll feel afterwards that it was worthwhile. These slides, oh, that's great. Marianne has these slides, and so I think if you can circulate them afterwards. Yeah?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so the slides will come through to you afterwards. And I'd like to talk to you a bit about the thinking work that we've done in South Africa around military social work. I'm going to talk a little bit as well about the history of social work in South Africa and a bit of the context there, because I think it's quite an interesting history. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about research and some of the things that I think the military in South Africa has done that enabled some of the thinking work that I'm going to present to you. So just, that was me 17 years ago, when I was still young and had brown hair and was skinny. Marianne's actually given my CV, so I'm not going to go through all of that again, but just to say again that I'm 12 years now out of the military. And so I'm really speaking now about things that I have done in the past and not things that I'm currently doing. The director of social work was hoping to be here, but in the end was not able to attend, so I'm the only South African here now. So this is just a map of, or not a map, but a photograph of South Africa. I'm from Cape Town. I don't live there, unfortunately, right now. But my home, where I grew up, was just over the other side of the mountain, over there. And so that's where I'm coming from. The picture on the bottom right is the picture of Simonstown Naval Base, which is where I spent most of my military career when I was practicing as a military social worker. And so right on the coast. And my office was also just here on the edge of the hill, and then I would walk down into the dockyard to go and work with the submarines and the strike craft and so on. And then on the bottom left is the picture of the University of Johannesburg, where I teach now. And you can see, well, you can't really see, but the university logo, which is up at the top there, is two hoopoes, which is this little bird in the middle. It's like a little woodpecker, African woodpecker, African hoopoe. So just a little bit about the Defence Force. Before 1994, which I'm sure all of you know is the year in which we transitioned from an apartheid government into a non-racial democracy, we had 4, 5, 7 military forces at play in South Africa area. We had the South African Defence Force, which was the Defence Force of South Africa and of the nationalist government, and I was a member of that organization. And we had 4 homeland defense forces. These were, in a way, reservations for particular tribes of African people, ethnic groups, Transkei, Botswana, Venda, and Ciskei, and they each had their own defense forces, quite small military forces. And those together we call statutory, because they all had legislation that mandated their role as militaries. And then we had 2 liberation forces. MKM was in Mkhonto weSizwe, which is the ANC's liberation wing, and APLA, the Azanian People's Liberation Army, which was the PAC's wing, which was a more radical left-wing group. And so, there we go. Did you do that? Well done. Bonus. So these 7 forces, which had really been in conflict with each other for decades, in 1994 were merged into one military force. And that was a really interesting period for social workers, for all of us really, but particularly for us as social workers in the Defence Force, because these former enemies of each other were now all of a sudden colleagues. And I remember one experience in particular that always stands out for me. I was doing some training around diversity and integration issues. We were training trainers, and we were having a conversation over lunch where someone was talking about a conflict that happened in Angola, and this conflict that they were having with the South African forces. And then one of the other trainees said, I was one of those South African forces. And they'd actually fought against each other, and both sides had lost people. So it was quite a profound moment of sort of reconciliation and everything that we aspire to in South Africa. Currently, since 1994, we have 4 arms of service in the South African National Defence Force, which is what we have now. We have the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, like most of you have. And what's perhaps distinctive about us is that we have a separate arm of service called the South African Military Health Service, SAMS, which is where social work is located. We wear a separate uniform And so this is the emblem for SAMS, the medical emblem, and social work particularly has this Kadushi, which is the welfare, the W Kadushi that we wear. And so a social worker will wear the same uniform that a doctor or a nurse or a physiotherapist or a dentist wears. And it doesn't matter whether you're working in the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy, you still wear your medical uniform. And that creates an interesting space in relation to what we talked on earlier, that you're military, but you're not Army. And you're not part of the Army or the Air Force or the Navy command structure. So you're kind of in, but you're not quite in. The Defense Force is also now under civilian control, and so we have a secretariat that oversees us. 73,000 members in a population of 52 million. I think that's about 0.13%. We were talking, some of us yesterday, around ratios of military to population. And about 85% of those are uniformed. And primarily because I just want to show you sort of what military social workers can rise to. We have a total of 171 star generals, and that includes Brigadier General Muremi, who's the now retired director. She just retired a month or two ago. So the most senior social work post is a Brigadier General, 1-star general. And we have 42 star generals, major generals, and that includes Major General Mamela Matumi, who's the woman you see there. She was the former director of social work, and she's now a more senior position in human resources. So she's our most senior social worker in the military. We have a total of 167 social workers, and the vast majority, and when I say vast majority, I would say like 160 of those are uniformed social workers. I see that number's a bit bigger than the one that you had, but I got this number just now from there. So that works out at a ratio of about 500 military employees per social worker, which is, I think, a pretty good ratio. That's General Matumi again in the middle there with myself and a couple of other social workers. So I thought it's important for us, I think, to keep reminding ourselves that we're social workers and not just mental health practitioners or some sort of more general category. And what does it mean to be a social worker? And certainly in South Africa, we've tried very hard to think about being a social worker in the military and all of the things that implies. And it's things like our commitment to those who are vulnerable and marginalized, to those who are impoverished, to those who are silenced, to those who are oppressed. And in South Africa, because of our history of systemic racism and oppression, those values around human rights, social justice, human dignity, and so on, are especially important and remain important to us now, 25 or so years later. We keep reminding ourselves that casework, counseling, is just one of the many methods that we learn, and we have used community development quite extensively in how we've thought about the role of a military social worker. We really want to embrace the full spectrum of micro, meso, macro practice. We keep thinking about person and environment, that old concept that Mary Richmond coined for us over 100 years ago is quite foundational in social work, what we would now call ecosystems or ecological perspective. And we have a particular role and interest in issues of transformation, again, because of the Defense Force's experience of integrating these former forces that were at war with each other into one coherent, cohesive workforce. So we keep these things in the back of our mind as we've developed and thought about who we are as military social workers. And so within that broad framework, one of the key things that we've done that we felt was important to talk a bit about today, which we've raised already, is that we think of military social work as a form of occupational social work. And so as we go to the literature to say what informs our practice, that's the main body of literature that we have drawn on. Social work is often thought of, as Applewhite wrote back in '95, as a clinical social work and even mental health practice. And a lot of what we've talked about even this morning has had quite a strong sort of mental health focus and a clinical focus, a DSM-5 focus. Harris back in '93, but there were even authors before that, before the '90s, wrote about military social work as an expression or a form of occupational social work. And we drew on that literature, particularly after 1994, as we began rethinking and repositioning our practice. So within occupational social work, we talk about the employee as person, which is really focusing on the personal needs, the family life, the personal well-being, or psychological functioning and relational functioning of an employee. But we're also interested in the person as employee, which is thinking about their role as a worker within the organization. So they're a soldier, they're an infantryman, or they're a bomber, and how do they deal with all of those kinds of roles? Huggins and Davidson were, I think, the people who first wrote about the organization as client. And so we've increasingly thought around what is our responsibility towards the military itself as an organization, and can we think about them themselves as a client rather than just the people within the organization. And a colleague of ours, Renee Carapina, has also written about the employee as citizen, where she's tried to extend the notion from just the military organization to being a member of society. And again, in South Africa, because of our long history of institutionalized racism, the role of all of us within our society, within the community, and as active citizens has become quite central in our thinking about what we do. So we have a well-developed civic education program in the Defence Force that everybody has to participate in. And Arista Boer, who was my first social work supervisor, has talked about how occupational social work allows us to do system-wide interventions. So we're not just focusing on individuals in the workplace, but actually we're trying to intervene with the workplace itself as a social system and make changes in that system in much the same way that we might do in community work. So we earlier on got a definition, it was the Guggins and Davidson definition, I think, but I personally like this very old definition from Straussner of occupational social work, where she says it's a specialized field of social work practice which addresses the human and social needs of the work community through a variety of interventions which aim to foster optimal adaptation between individuals and their environments. And I like the focus on specialized, that she recognizes this to be a field of practice and requiring specialized skills and knowledge in order to work in the space. I particularly like her use of the term work community, because I think it reminds us that the workplace is not just a company or an organization or a business, but it's actually a community, just like any other neighborhood. And that enables us to go back to neighborhood practice. I think of Henderson and Thomas, Skills of Neighborhood Work, that body of literature, which we often, I think, lose sight of a little bit when we're working in a corporate or a workplace environment. And then the optimal adaptation goes back to the point I made earlier on around person and environment. So with that as a foundation, we then began trying to develop specific concepts around what military social work is about within that broad paradigm. And I want to present to you two key ideas that come out of what we call the military social work practice model. And the first idea is this, of binocular vision. It's not a term that we really coined ourselves. Wilfred Bion talks about binocular vision, and you'll see some of the psychodynamic stuff coming in, because my training is clinical. I'm trained as an object relations therapist. But the idea here is that when we look at the work community, the space within which we work, we need to have two eyes focusing on two different things. With the one eye, this eye on your left, we're looking with a telescopic lens at the macro system, the workplace as a whole, the military as a whole, with its mission, its need to be operationally ready, its need for soldiers to be equipped and able to go out at a moment's notice and do its mission. So on the one hand, we're committed to enabling the military to do its business. On the other hand, with the right eye, we're looking with a microscopic perspective at the individuals in the organization. And so the individual soldier and the family members around that individual person, and that manager over there, and that commanding officer over there. And we're concerned for their individual welfare and well-being. And to be a good occupational social worker, we say, you have to be able to keep both eyes open. So I'd like you to do a little exercise, if you would, for me. Let me be the lecturer just for a moment. And I'd like you to take one hand and put your finger over here in front of your left eye at about this distance there. What's that, about 10 centimeters or so? And just make sure you can actually focus on that finger. Okay, make sure it's in focus. And then take your other hand and put it a little bit further out. And with your right eye, see if you can focus on that finger. Can you do that both? So you can focus on the one and you can focus on the other. Now try to focus on them both at the same time. See if you can get them both in focus. How are you doing? Are you managing?
For a second.
For a second. Do you find you kind of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? Yeah. So if you keep trying to do it too long, you start to get a headache. And your eyes start to go a bit sort of wonky, because actually it's not really possible. We're not chameleons. And so we can't actually focus close and far at the same time. And so when we're teaching young social workers, this is the little part of education that we do as in-service training, we teach them this to say that being able to focus telescopically and microscopically at the same time is really impossible. We just physically, you can't actually do it. And so the key thing is to be going backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards between the two eyes, which will give you a headache. If you don't experience a headache, then what that means is you've closed one of your eyes. And that's what we don't want you to do. We don't want you to close an eye. And we've seen some social workers close the microscopic eye and they focus only on the organization. They spend all their time with management, they're interested in the organization's mission, and they insist that everybody must deliver and produce the mission. And then we have other social workers who become activists, if you want. They focus on the individuals, they'll lobby for the rights of the individual soldiers in their communities, sometimes at the expense of mission. And both of those are problematic. What we really have to do is to keep both eyes open at the same time, and that should cause a headache, and you should keep the headache because that lets you know that you're actually doing good social work practice. It is in effect person and environment, isn't it? Because that's the person and that's the environment. Actually, it's just, I mean, it's what Mary Richmond wrote about many, many years ago, as person and situation. But we're just trying to apply it a little bit into the military space. So if we had a class of young military social workers, we would give them pieces of plastic, clear plastic cellophane. We would give them a toilet roll tube, which is a short one, and a sort of I don't know what you call it here, glad wrap, saran wrap, what do you call it? One of those tubes, longer tube, and they would draw a picture of the person and stick it on the end of the small one, and they would draw a little organization, stick it at the end of the long one, and they would create binoculars, which is the binocular vision. And so they would look through it, but this is a quick way to do it. So this is the one idea that we have developed. Just to mention that you'll see at the bottom of the slides references, and there's a reference list for all of those. And if people want, I could share the actual articles if that would be useful, but otherwise we could just circulate the references. The second piece of the practice model that we developed, so this is now a bit more of a practical expression of the binocular vision, is this positions model. And the notion of positions, for those of you who train psychodynamically, comes from Melanie Klein, who talks about positions in early childhood, the depressive and schizoid positions. A lot of the occupational social work literature talks about us moving from micro towards macro practice and presents us with phases that as you become a more capable occupational social worker, you leave behind therapeutic work and you move on to organizational interventions. And we have a problem with that phased approach, which seems to say that this is bad and this is good. And instead, we've used the term position to show that all of these different approaches to practice are equally important. What's important, though, is to have the diversity, so to be competent to move between these different positions. So in the model, we say the social worker places herself in the center of the model, and she chooses which of these four positions is the most appropriate one to use in this case, or this example, or this intervention. So very quickly, the four positions are as follows. Restorative interventions, which are position one, are focused on the employee as person, so they're more personally oriented in terms of their intervention, and they're therapeutic or restorative in their orientation. So a client or a family has a problem, we try to help them with that problem. So that could be depression or an anxiety issue, it could be family violence, it could be a marital conflict, a problem with the children, substance abuse, any of those kind of personal problems that employees and their families might have, and we do therapeutic type interventions in this way. Those interventions are not necessarily individual. So all of these could be at the micro, the meso, or the macro level. We're not saying these are specifically individual, but they are restorative and therapeutic in their intention. Position 2 interventions are promotive, and these are more focused not so much on people who have a problem, but on preventing the possible development of problems. So it's your secondary and tertiary, primary, secondary, tertiary prevention interventions. So all the things around development. So stress inoculation training, building marital enrichment programs, parenting programs, all of these financial management courses all would fall under position 2, promoting the well-being and the healthy functioning of members of the workforce community. Once we move to positions 3 and 4, we begin to think about the person as an employee. That's the key shift. So on the left, it's much more personal in its orientation. On the right-hand side, we're thinking much more about the work-related issues that employees have. Position 3 is work-person intervention, and you'll see these two are quite similar. The key difference is person and place. That's the key difference in the term here. So work-person intervention has to do with addressing fit between the organization and the people in the organization, particularly focused on the people and helping people adjust to the demands of the organization. So anything that is about preparing families and soldiers for deployment, for example, would be a work-person intervention. It's trying to help employees and families deal with the challenges and the demands of deployment. But it could also be conflict resolution within the workplace. So if the Human Resources Division is having issues in their space and conflict between employees or managers, and we're going to do conflict resolution, that would also be a work-person intervention. And then the workplace interventions, position 4, are focused on the place itself. This is what Guggens and them call organization as client. And so this would include, for example, development of policy, where we try and change the way things are done in our organization. And that could be at a macro and national level. So if you're the director of social work, that would be something you do. But it can also be at a more micro level, at the level of the unit itself, and shifting how things are done in that organization. So we encourage the social workers in the South African National Defence Force to become competent in terms of skills and knowledge for all 4 of these positions. And what we're looking for is that a well-experienced and capable social worker who moves up the ranks from lieutenant to captain to major is the person who is able to work effectively and comprehensively at all 4 positions. What I want to try to illustrate in the last few slides is positions 3 and 4, and emphasize how that looks in practice and what are some of the things that we've done in South Africa to develop those. And the first is that we've adopted quite deliberately a resilience lens. I hear that a lot now, so it's really cool, but back in the early 1990s, when I was thinking about resilience, I couldn't find much literature on this. But a lot of this, my thinking, has been influenced by Hamilton McCubbin, and I wonder if any of you know McCubbin's work. I mean, McCubbin was, in my view, the most effective person to write about family resilience. I mean, he grew up in America in the military system and really developed substantial theory as well as assessment tools around family resilience. So in the early 90s, through my initial work in the Navy, I began using this term deployment resilience, which I now see is quite widely used, but in those days, not particularly known. So we try to understand and think about the capacity of soldiers to deploy is dependent in part on the resilience of themselves, but also of their family, to withstand the stress that's inherent in a deployment. From that, we developed the Deployment Resilience Seminar, which I published in 1999 in Families and Society. That was part of my master's dissertation, so I wrote that up for that. So that was a one-day psychoeducational program for couples to develop within the family system the ability to withstand the stress of soldiers leaving and coming back. And what our research had shown was that it was those transitions in and out of the family system that created stress. Not so much the being separate, but rather the movement within and out the system. A little bit later, our Defence Force began doing this, what they call a concurrent health assessment, which is the idea that we want to know the health status of every soldier at this point in time, hence current, so that if we have to deploy tomorrow, we know who's ready to deploy and who needs to stay behind. And social work played an important role in this assessment. So it's a multi-professional assessment from the South African Military Health Service. And so we developed the Military Social Health Index, which I did for my doctoral thesis, in order to assess the resilience of military families. And I'll show you in the next slide what that looks like. Out of that assessment, we developed a model of resilience for military families. And then we developed a quantitative assessment tool, which is the IMSHI I mentioned there, as well as an assessment protocol, so a qualitative interview schedule for clinical assessment. And then last of all, more recently, we've begun thinking about the resilience of the workplace itself. So what makes the workplace itself resilient? Not just the individuals in the place, but actually the system as a whole. And so we've tried quite deliberately to integrate resilience thinking and theory throughout all of this process, drawing not only on the work of people like McCubbin, but also on research that we've done ourselves in South Africa. So this is the SADOD resilience model of social health. If you are familiar with McCubbin's work, then you'll recognize this sort of the broad frame of this draws on some of the earlier models that he developed on family resilience. So we say that the social health or the social maladjustment of a soldier and their family on this end is a combination of three main factors. The first is the stressor, which in this case is deployment. We know that deployments can be more or less stressful depending on how they're managed, combined with vulnerability and resilience. And the vulnerability that we look at in the model has to do with pre-existing social problems. So families already experience conflict, violence, substance abuse, and so on. That increases their vulnerability. The pile-up of adverse events, so if they recently got married or had a child, that will increase their vulnerability, as well as work-to-family interference, which is just that sort of boundary management spillover theory. Combined with four aspects of resilience: the availability of robust support systems for the family, their problem-solving skills, and so their ability to deal with problems, because we figure that problems are going to happen inevitably during a deployment. So the capacity of the family to resolve and manage those problems in the absence of the soldier is important. Stressor appraisal, which is how people think about the stressor and how they make sense of it, which in South Africa has always been quite challenging because the military has always been perceived as in quite negative terms. Always quite admire the Americans because you make a big thing about military people. It's like they're heroes. In South Africa, our people are not heroes. They don't tell them that they're military. And then generalized resistance resources, which is a cluster of a range of different resilience factors, and some of them quite simple things like spending time together as a family, one's cultural identity and faith, and so on. So we're saying it's a combination of those factors that leads to social health. And in the Military Social Health Index that we use for the concurrent health assessment, these are the things that we measure. So those are the constructs that we measure for that assessment. So I wanted to briefly mention, as I wrap this up, about military social work research and the way in which we've thought about and constructed research capacity within the South African National Defence Force to generate these kinds of products and ideas. In part, these innovations were enabled by the establishment of the Military Social Work Research and Development Department. And in 1996, a social work research department was created at MPI, which is the Military Psychological Institute, which had always been staffed just by psychologists, who developed assessment tools for pilots and submariners and commanders, who did organizational interventions and also did some psychological research. And they created this sole social work post in this psychological unit. A year later, somebody else was initially appointed, and then they left, and then I was appointed in 1997 as the first social work researcher there. Over the next 5 years, we expanded that from 1 post to 5 posts, and so posts were then deployed from other parts of the directorate into this department here. So we had 5 quite senior posts. I was a lieutenant colonel, and the other posts were majors and captains. And from 2002, I'd developed a military health research center, which is now an interdisciplinary research unit to address broad issues around health with psychologists, social workers, nurses, chaplains, operational medics, statisticians, and epidemiologists. So quite a diverse team of researchers, all focused on different aspects of health research, of which social work was one of our departments. So in addition to what I've described, these are a few of the other kinds of research projects that we've done to show that there's quite a diversity. We designed and developed the entire HIV prevention program for the National Defence Force, which is a peer education system, which we call Masabambisani. We designed and implemented the monitoring and evaluation of that program, including HIV CAP studies, so large annual surveys around knowledge, attitudes, and practices around sexual behavior and other risks. We developed M&E systems for social work, for a military hospital, for the Chief Director of Transformation Management, and for other parties. So we began developing expertise in M&E, thanks primarily, in fact, to we got funded by USAID and CDC, and we spent some time at CDC in Atlanta and learned a lot about M&E during that time. We did a national study on violence towards women and children in the military that led to the development of policy on the prevention of violence. We did studies on gender mainstreaming and the role of women in combat. We participated in the NIH, so National Institutes of Health here in the US, funded the development of an antiretroviral program called PDISA, and we were part of that. We did research on peacekeeping and cultural diversity training and various other things. So this team of 5 social work researchers was involved in a wide range of basic as well as applied research and development. And I think as I've reflected for today a little bit on sort of what enabled all of this to take place, I think that there were 5 main factors in the military that enabled this. And the first was a sense of strategic focus and energy from the top. And particularly General Matumi, who I think you'd said, Renee, that you'd met her some years ago, was a visionary as the Director of Social Work when she was still a Brigadier General. And so she conceptualized the need for research, and then once she had that resource, she really made use of it to inform her strategic decisions. So I think there was this energy and focus from the top. Secondly, there was a sort of an element of talent management. When the Defence Force recognized social workers who had talent, such as myself, then we were pulled up into the system. So we said, oh, we don't just need you in the unit there, we want you here. And so we gathered together this group of people who had real expertise and interest and capability to do research and development. That, I think, was partnered with an entrepreneurial spirit, which was just the sense that we don't have to keep on doing the same thing over and over. We can actually do things differently, and we can be creative in the way that we do military social work. And then assigning human and financial resources, because these things cost money. You do need people, you're going to put them here rather than there, and you need money for actual research. And so acquiring the financial resources for all of that. And then lastly, I've sort of summarized as the SWOT analysis, but in a sense it's sort of looking at what are the opportunities and how do we have the capabilities to address those? So what are the key points in the military where we can do interesting creative development? And who are the right people to enable that to happen? And aligning those two, I think, is part of what enabled us to do, when I look back, I think some quite creative, interesting thinking work, as well as development work around military social work. So that's the references, and all of those we can make available to you. And what I'd like to do now, if that's okay with you, is we go straight into a buzz group discussion so that you just talk quickly amongst yourselves about what you've heard, because I've talked a lot, and then we'll have some time for open discussion around all of that. So buzz groups just means the person next to you. You don't have to do this with your whole table, just 2 of you or 3. And we want you to think about these 4 questions if you have time. The first is, how appropriate would occupational social work be in your context as a foundation for military social work? So does that feel like that's an approach to social work that would fit in your space? Secondly, the military social work practice model, which is the binocular vision as well as those 4 positions. How could they be adopted or adapted into your country context? Thirdly, consider the use of resilience in your context for both personal, so family practice, so the kind of person as an employee as person, but also in the more operational and military contexts. And lastly, imagine what you could accomplish if you had a small team of dedicated social work research and development in your military. So if you could create a little department with 1 or 2 people, how could things change as a result of that? So we'll give, I think, about 10 minutes?
At the most, yeah.
At the most?
So, yeah, 5, 10.
5, 10 minutes, and then after that we'll just have open conversation. We don't have to talk about these 4, we can talk about anything.